At first, they tried to ignore the nightmares. But in the years since the trip, an accident had caused a head injury that left Jim with epilepsy. Now, lack of sleep was making his seizures worse. Jack was worried about him.
I said, well, what's keeping you up at night? And he said, I don't really want to, And I said, come on, if you can't tell me, who are you going to tell? I'm your twin. You can tell me anything. So he said, well, I've been having these awful nightmares. And he starts telling me the same nightmare. And I said, oh, this is really bizarre because I've been having that same dream.
Two brothers in separate cities having identical nightmares, and they were getting worse.
My doctors who were treating me at Beth Israel Hospital for the epilepsy started to notice, and they started getting really concerned about it. And at first, I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want these people to think I was, over the deep, deep end here. I wanted them to help me with my seizures. I didn't want them to think I was going crazy.
But alien abduction was not the diagnosis that Jim was expecting.
They eventually got out of me why I wasn't sleeping, and I told him about these nightmares. He said to me, well, geez, Jim, I've heard this story before, and it sounds a lot like an abduction story to me. And I'm not sure that's what happened to you, but I've heard this before, and I think you should talk to somebody who's a professional in the field.
Enter Ray Fowler, well known in the world of UFO investigation for being tenacious and thorough. He's been a UFO investigator for 35 years. He also teaches night courses out of his home for the local community college. The most popular by far is the one on UFOs.
What I'd like to do is open the class up for an open discussion.
They seem to be able to travel in and out of our dimension. Do you think that
Ray's family doesn't want to hear about his UFO work, so he's glad these students do.
This raises all kinds of questions concerning the origin of UFOs. Are they
his students provide him with a sense of community. But it's Ray's cases, like the Wiener investigation, that feed his hunger for work on the front lines of the UFO mystery.
A young man came up to me and told me about this missing time experience he had up on the Allagash waterway.
And I felt I felt totally stupid that I had to go and tell this guy this totally bizarre story, making myself look like a complete idiot.
And I politely listened for a while, and I sort of tried to get rid of him because I really wasn't that much interested. I get stories like this all the time. Then he mentioned his brother was a twin.
He said, wait a minute, you said you had an identical twin? And I said, yeah. And you said you went out with the fire. When you came back, the fire was out, and only a few minutes went by, and he said, well, I think you better tell me the whole thing. I would like to hear your whole story. And he said this sounded like a missing time case to him, and he wanted to know if we would go along with a more in-depth investigation. And my reaction to missing time, what the heck is he talking about, missing time? He didn't say, oh, I believe you had a UFO experience. He said, well, I believe that you think something remarkable has happened to you. We said, well, look, if you think it'll help, then sure, we'll be glad to answer any questions you want. We'll be, all we can do is tell you what happened, what we remember.
The first step for Ray was to check the Wiener's credibility.
We went to people that they had talked to after their camping trip to see if they reported the same incident back in 1976 as they were reporting to us. We checked with the ranger, for example, that they reported to, the sighting, astronomical data, weather data. Very important to establish witness credibility by doing a rigid character reference check, checking with their employers, checking friends, and so forth. Later on, we did a polygraph test and a psychological test, and came pretty well convinced that these people were real, they're really telling the truth.
Jack didn't like the lie detector test. It's bad enough to be called crazy, but the implication that he might be making the whole thing up was even worse.
Because we aren't dealing with automobile crashes or plane crashes, we're dealing with UFO abductions by aliens who can take people at will and subject them to physical examinations. It's so far out and so bizarre that you've got to document these cases meticulously or no one's going to believe you.
And maybe not even then. There is no law enforcement agency that investigates alien abduction, no toll-free number to call. And Claire, unlike the Wieners, had no access to Ray Fowler's services. She did have Diana, who started reading books on the subject. But the more Diana read, the more she began to fear that she too was involved.
Unfortunately, when I got into, finally found some of the books that were dealing more with abductions, I started getting scared because I kept thinking, gee, that sounds awful familiar.
Diana's reading raised the alarming possibility in her mind that not only had both women been abducted, but they had been abducted together as children.
I guess what was really strange about when we started talking about our childhood memories, we seemed to have very similar memories, like we'd gone through the same experience, that we knew each other, but we'd never met till 8 years ago. We never knew each other in childhood.
We couldn't have known each other in childhood.
No, I lived all over the country. Claire lived in Virginia.
So how could we possibly have these memories of being together as children when we couldn't possibly have been together as children?
Unless something had taken them from their homes, brought them together, and then returned them to their unsuspecting families.
I remembered an incident when I was about 12 years old, and it was during the summer when we were out on a picnic. I was out with friends from school. I recalled moving away from my friends and sitting on a picnic bench waiting. And I was very annoyed. I remembered being annoyed because I was waiting for her. I looked around and there she was. I recognized her, but yet I didn't because she had an English accent and I didn't know anybody with an English accent. Also, she was wearing a uniform. She had this jacket.
Yeah, that's what triggered it for me. When Claire told me how old she was, it made me about 9 years old, and I lived in England at that time. I went to English schools, British schools, and I had a blue jacket, just like the one she was describing. It was my uniform jacket from school. And what was even stranger than that was I had kept that jacket, and I knew exactly where it was.
And I described the emblem.
And I pulled the jacket out, and it was exactly the same.
With the same emblem on it. At that time, I was not aware Diana had ever lived in England. I didn't know that.
We couldn't explain that one away.
A school jacket from long before they had supposedly ever met, with an emblem that both women clearly remembered. Claire and Diana began searching their past, comparing childhood memories.
How old are you in this one?
Claire would think of something and write it down on a piece of paper, and then she'd ask me a question, such as, imagine you're a small child, and you have this box in front of you, what would you do with it? And my immediate reaction is I would turn it inside out with my mind, because that's exactly what she had been made to do with the box. She remembered 2 small children, herself, and another small blonde girl, being in this room and being forced to figure out what to do with this box. And it was, turn it inside out with your mind.
Memories of children forced to play games of the mind. But why? And by whom?
These same beings, whatever they were present whenever we were present.
Always in the background, somewhere just on the edge of your vision, there was one of these great guys.
At least one.
At least one.
Watching.
But not all the games were so innocent.
The fire stick was not a fun time. We both had memories of being in a round room with one of the gray guys with this stick. And he would throw the stick and it would whiz around the room. And we would try and catch it, but it would burn. I remember us standing back to back in this room with this fire stick whizzing around, knowing that it would hurt anytime it touched us. And finally coming to the conclusion that we together had to make that stick go back to that alien. We could control it with our minds.
But it was scary in the sense that somehow the rules had changed. Now, instead of there being sort of a learning, fun, new kind of, we don't have these games at home, to an experience that was frightening, intimidating, where there was only one way out. And what if you never got it right?